The railways on the Isle of Wight were once a vast network of lines, branching out to all four of its corners. From Cowes to Ventnor, Bembridge to Freshwater, small Victorian tank engines trundled up and down these rural single-track lines, pulling their ancient wooden body carriages until the end of steam in 1966.
Now last year my partner Nell and I did a series where we walked every disused railway line on the island, albeit with a few diversions around private land. And in doing so we also walked the first railway built on the island, which is the Cowes to Newport Railway.
It was constructed in 1862 and lasted till the end of the steam era, transporting locals and holidaymakers from the ferry port of Cowes to the island's capital at Newport. It also featured the island's very first railway tunnel at Mill Hill. But was this line in fact the first railway on the Isle of Wight? Well, sort of.
Now if we're talking about the conventional railway system, i.e. locomotive hauled passenger and goods traffic on a standard gauge track, much like the network we still have today, then the Cowes to Newport line was definitely the first railway built on the island. But if we broaden that analysis a little bit to include tramways, then there is an anomaly, a line which was built before the Cowes to Newport line, and in fact picked it at the post by some margin. I'm Jack, welcome to WightWanderer, and today we are on the hunt for the Isle of Wight's very first railway.
Built in 1832, 30 years before the aforementioned Cowes to Newport line, little is known about this railway enigma. Perhaps the most obvious of its oddities being its placement, constructed nowhere near any of the island's major towns.
It was in fact built here between Hamstead and Newtown Creek, one of the remotest and seldom visited places on the island, and also one of the most naturally diverse. But why on earth build a tramway here in the middle of nowhere, miles away from any town? Well, that was all down to one man, a man by the name of Nash.
John Nash, to be precise, who was a highly successful and royally celebrated British architect. Throughout his creative life, he designed some of London's greatest architecture, including Haymarket Theatre, Park Crescent, and the Marble Arch itself. Nash's architectural blueprint is in fact so substantial it could merit a series of its own. But for the context of this video, we are focusing on his later life. In 1830, John retired to his home at East Cowes Castle, designed by himself and completed in 1800. In 1803, John purchased Lower Hamstead Estate, building a brickworks on site in the early 1830s. And during this time, he completely redesigned the area of Hamstead Farm. In doing this, John Nash built a tramway to transport goods from the estate to the docks and vice versa. After its construction in 1832, various documents record some of the goods that was transported along the rails. But a couple of years later, all mention of the tramway had faded out. And here lies the problem.
The main issue is lack of information, especially in map form. In fact, the only map I can find is this one, and as you can probably tell, it's not ideal. Furthermore, the early detailed OS maps of the 1860s show no indication that any kind of railway ever came through here. So I really am blindsided with this one.
Luckily though, there are a couple of points on the map which do appear to follow the same rough alignment of features and tree lines still visible in the area. For example, though the map is not to scale, it does appear to imitate certain curves where you would expect to find them. If we overlay the map onto a modern satellite image, it looks something like this, which at first glance may look about right, but there are one or two contrasting areas. For example, this tree line, which appears to mimic the tramway curve, but further towards the east than the map indicates. Another would be on the southern loop, where I believe the tree line indicates that the railway followed the lane closer than depicted. Taking these defects and others into consideration, this is what I came up with, and where I believe roughly the tramway ran.
So I'm here at the boatyard. You can see Newtown Creek just behind me there. Over there is where the brickworks would have been, and it's from here that the horses would have pulled their carts along the rails up towards Hamstead House.
There appears to be little evidence of the brickworks left, apart from one or two crumbling walls in the area. Nonetheless, this place would have been a hive of activity, loading and unloading goods and smelting furnaces. As we start to walk up towards Hamstead Estate along the southern loop, it becomes abundantly clear that this line is not going to be as easy to trace as other lost railways.
Now, because this is effectively guesswork on my part, I'm going to be relying on my little bit of knowledge about walking abandoned railway lines. So I'm going to be looking for things in particular like embankments, like gullies, but also like bits of land between lanes and fields that have been left to nature.
Just around the corner though, my guess that the tramway in fact followed the lane closer than depicted does appear to somewhat hold up.
See, that looks to me like a place where a railway would have been. Let's have a look.
It's difficult not to get swept away into the void of imagination. But again, this gap of seemingly untouched wild nature between the lane and the field boundary does smack of an old railway line. And as we move further along, other old structures seem to appear in the denseness of the undergrowth. Gullies also appear, as well as this odd stone structure. Whether it was anything to do with the tramway, I cannot say, but it does appear to follow the exact alignment of where I placed the tramway on the map. A little while later, the lane chicanes around a bit of woodland. Here I believe the tramway once again disappeared into the dense foliage. A little further down the line, I came across a gap in the woodland.
Now, this is just the kind of place I was talking about earlier, a bit of land between the lane and the field, which has seemingly just been left to nature. But as railway nerds know, old lines do tend to be left to the elements, and this is quite indicative of an old railway line. There is quite a bit of a gully down here as well, whether that's an old riverbed or an old stream. It's dried up now, but there's also quite a big embankment over here, so I'm going to have a look at that.
After a brief glance around, with nothing in particular standing out in the dense nettles, I retreated back to the lane.
One thing's for sure, I shouldn't have worn shorts. That was a mistake on my part.
But with no time to moan, I continued along the southern loop to the point in which the tramway changed direction quite drastically.
I don't want to rely too much on the primitive map, the early map, because obviously it's not to scale. But according to that, it does say that there was a passing loop around here somewhere. And from here, the tramway actually swung north before it reached Hamstead Drive. And I can see why, because just behind me, the lane itself drops away quite drastically. So I reckon at this point, this is the point where the tramway would have swung north. You can see there is this field boundary. Now I reckon that would have been the alignment of the tramway. This is just guesswork, of course, but looking at the this hill I'm walking down, I don't see how a tramway could have ever gotten down here, even with horses pulling the carts, unless there was some big engineering structure, but there isn't, and there wouldn't have been.
Heading around to Hamstead Drive, the nature of this stunning place becomes a spectacle. As we continue, we come across an unexpected sight. What appears to be the body of an old railway box van. Alongside it, perhaps just as intriguing, an ex-Southern Vector's Iveco hopper bus. It is at this point that the tramway joined Hamstead Drive, as it approached the estate itself.
once again there appears to be a bit of a gap between the lane and the field next door, with this little bit of wilderness in between. So I'm wondering, once again indicative of an abandoned railway, whether the tramway came through here alongside the lane.
John Nash died in 1835, just 2 years after the completion of the tramway. But his wife and widow, Mary Ann, who fell in love with the place, made it her permanent residence after John's death. The house was later replaced by Hamstead Grange, which can still be seen today. Further along we come across these ruins, which appear to line up with the site of the original house on the map. Though I am told that apparently these are the remains of an old brickworks. I'm not sure about this though, so what do you think? Please comment below. In the meantime, it's time to get back to the tramway, as we trace the loop line back down to the creek. The tree line on the map appears to line up with the direction of the tramway, and luckily for me, it's a footpath with a spectacular view over Newtown Creek.
So I'm continuing to follow the loop line back down from Hamstead to Newtown Creek, and at some point here it curves. Now this field boundary behind me would be an obvious candidate for where it curved, but there is an anomaly on the map. This curvature further along the line towards the east would link up perfectly with the field boundary today. But in order for the tramway to directly link up to that curvature, it would in fact have to pass right across the field behind me. Now looking at the topography of the land, I do in fact think it did exactly that. Now there's the obvious choice, the tree line, but in fact to link up with the curvature that I showed earlier, further down the line, it would have had to run directly across the field there. And looking at the flatness of the land, it does seem possible. The only problem for me now though is that the footpath doesn't go there, it goes there. So what I'm going to do is follow the footpath back down to the lane, and then trying to find another footpath further down to join the alignment of the tramway.
Heading back down to the lane, we retrace our steps a little before finding a footpath which opens out onto one of the many picturesque areas on the creek.
Now bear with me on this one because it's a little bit far-fetched, but I in fact think that that mass of trees there is this mass of trees on the map, and if we assume that that curvature is in fact the curvature of the tramway coming back down, then that means that the line would have passed right over this bit of the creek. So I assume what's happened is in fact the waters in the creek have eroded away the line, the trajectory of the tramway coming back down to the brickworks. So this in fact was the alignment of the tramway directly across there, I think.
Shortly after this, the line rejoined the southern loop, just before re-entering the area of the brickyard and the quay.
And here we are back at the boatyard with the beautiful Newtown Creek in the background. So what have we learned about this railway? Well, it is long gone. In fact, if it wasn't for the small amount of information we do have about this tramway, then it could have been completely lost to the void of forgotten history. There is almost nothing to indicate that a railway ever came through here. And why would there be? Because it was a very small railway and it only lasted a couple of years. And that seems to be the end of the story for the Hamstead tramway itself. But not quite, because there may be a few physical remnants left of this tramway. In fact, not here, but in the famous yachting haven of Cowes. And here I'm going to segue to tomorrow, and hopefully the sun is still shining. So yes, it is a different day, and I've come here to Northwood House in Cowes, and the reason I'm actually here is because I got an anonymous tip-off online that apparently when the tramway was pulled up, a lot of its rails were used as border posts for the Northwood House estate. Now a lot of these posts have actually rusted out over the years, but apparently there still is one left, as they were unable to remove it because it was too deep in the ground. but unfortunately I'm going to have to be a bit cheeky to be able to get to it.
There are a couple of reasons why these rails are thought to have been from the tramway. Firstly is Nash's friendship with the Ward family, who owned Northwood at the time. Indeed, Nash remodelled Northwood House, and even built some of the estate's structures you can still see today. Secondly, the rails were narrow gauge, like the tramway itself, and all the other railways on the island were standard. Like I said, most have now rusted out and been replaced, but hidden away in a corner of the gardens behind some foliage. This one remains, a small rusty reminder of something significant and often overlooked, the very first railway built on the Isle of Wight.
And that was the story of the Hamstead Tramway. Thank you very much for watching. We will see you again very soon for another video. So take care, enjoy the sun, and all the best.